before I start, I want to disclaim that the man in this video doesn't make it clear whether he believes in any of this, so in good faith, I won't assume he does. But instead of critical race theorists, I'm going to say critical race theorists for brevity and because it's true. That's what they are. Let's begin.
I think critical race theory is one of those things that a lot of people have opinions about, but most people don't have a deep understanding of.
I don't always need a deep understanding of something to have strong opinions on it. For example, most people learn that the Nazis killed 6 million Jews, and that's enough information to reasonably and justifiably condemn them without having read any of Hitler's books or even knowing that Nazi ideology is a form of socialism.
And I think the reason for that is because explanations of critical race theory tend to be kind of glossy, where people just list the major beliefs and claims of critical race theorists without going into where they came from.
Again, all you need to do is list the major beliefs of the KKK, and you already know it's a horrible way of life. Most people condemn the KKK, rightfully so, without knowing any of their history. For example, most people don't know that the KKK worked for the Democratic Party in the US, but they still condemn the KKK for their blatant bigotry.
But at the same time, critical race theory is impending in the lives of a lot of people, either in the workplace or maybe in the education system.
That's because far leftists are shoving their ideology down the throats of children in school, even without the parents' consent, and elements of critical race theory are taught in mandatory sensitivity and diversity training in workplaces that have nothing to do with politics. I understand critical race theory is a part of law school, but if it's also injected in places where it doesn't belong, like elementary schools.
And I think people deserve sort of a gloves-off, very straightforward explanation of it that doesn't soften anything for politically correct reasons.
I don't think anything should be softened for politically correct reasons, so I can respect that. The only things that should be censored or softened is when it's being taught or shown to a child audience too young to understand or not be traumatized by the material.
So I'm going to try to provide that, while at the same time prioritizing trying to be fair and accurate and not exaggerating anything for political reasons.
Well, thank you. I actually appreciate that. I don't think anything should be exaggerated for political reasons, so I will do my best to do the same.
So to do that, I'm going to be using these 5 books, which are 5 of their most influential pieces of writing. And this is also going to be one of those sensitive subjects where I don't want to just say things and hope that you believe me. So if I say anything, even remotely controversial, I'll show on screen exactly where I'm getting it from.
That's all fine and good, and I wish more people would do it, but if it's coming from an asshole, I can guarantee it's going to be shit. Not saying you're an asshole, but most critical racists certainly are.
And to that point, let's get right into it and look at the main thing that makes critical race theorists distinct.
Okay, let's do this shit.
In their own words, what makes critical race theorists unusual compared to other academics on race and equality is their deep dissatisfaction with traditional civil rights discourse.
Discourse like Dr. King envisioning a country where his children are judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin? Really? They're deeply dissatisfied with that? Could it be because there are race grifters who make their money and living talking about racial conflict and they don't want to be out of a job? Or maybe it's because they themselves are racist assholes. I guess we'll find out.
Civil rights discourse means the values that society took coming out of the 60s and 70s civil rights era. So it could be the values of the civil rights movement itself, but it doesn't have to be. It's the values that society took away from the movement. So critical race theorists are saying that they don't like those values.
A lot of people had to die fighting for civil rights, but that's just not enough for critical racists, apparently. They want to keep being racially divisive, if only to get revenge for genuine oppression of their ancestors. But 2 wrongs don't make a right, and fucking children are smart enough to know. So I can't wait to see their line of reasoning. Fuck.
And they want to take us down a new track in America when it comes to race and racism. So trust me, we'll get into the new track that they want to take us down. But I think it helps first to look at the values that they're trying to replace.
They want to take you down a new track in America? Interesting, because they're trying to do the same shit here in Canada where I live. They're doing the same thing in the UK, they're doing the same thing in Australia. They seem to be trying to implement this all throughout the Western world. Seems like some sort of globalist initiative. like a reset of sorts. Doesn't help that a bunch, if not most of these critical racists are Marxists or socialists or communists. Yeah, I wonder if that's just a coincidence or if there's more to that foreshadowing.
And there's really just two main ones. One value is colorblindness, which is the attempt to take race out of your decision-making process.
And they have a problem with that? Are you fucking kidding me? What could possibly be the problem with that? Do they think we should take race into our decision-making process?
So for example, if you believe in colorblindness and you want to, say, design a colorblind law, it means that the law should be applied equally to everyone regardless of their race.
Of course it should. Any law that isn't applied equally to everyone regardless of their race is inherently unjust. Every time you give a group special privileges, you inevitably oppress another group. And just because racial minorities were oppressed in the past, that doesn't make it right to become the oppressors now. In fact, it's even worse because they know what it's like if they've lived through it. So why in the fuck would they want to put someone else through that? Someone who probably had no involvement in slavery, Jim Crow, or segregation. Make that make sense to me. Or sorry, you can't because it's fucking insane.
Or maybe if you want to be colorblind in your day-to-day life, it means that you don't give anyone preferential treatment or discriminatory treatment based on race.
Of course, that's just basic courtesy. Race isn't a relevant factor. No one is better or worse because of their race. The fact that critical racists have a problem with this says so much more about them than it does about society as a whole.
And critical race theorists basically say that colorblindness might be a nice idea, but they think that in reality, we're too racially biased for it to work.
Yeah, let me stop you right there. This is projection. The critical racists themselves are actually too racially biased for it to work, so they project that insecurity onto everyone else so that they don't have to take responsibility for it. They even go so far as to say you can't be racist if you're a minority, which gives them an excuse to be as racist as they want. Meanwhile, a white person who's done nothing wrong and is accused of being inherently racist, even though they can't possibly know the thoughts of every white person. You know what it's called when you judge an entire race and paint them with a broad brush? That's right, it's called racism. This is some hypocritical bullshit.
So if we're pretending that we're colorblind, but we're actually racially biased, then colorblindness is sort of like a facade that keeps us from meaningfully dealing with the racism in society.
Most people don't have to pretend. They just don't judge people based on race. Again, this is projection. The critical racists have to pretend, so they assume everyone else has to pretend, and they teach children who are genuinely colorblind that they're inherently racist if they happen to have white skin. And you're just shocked, baffled why people have strong negative opinions about this? Seriously, give me a fucking break.
So that's one value that they're against. And the second value that they disagree with that came out of the civil rights era is racial integration. Racial integrationism is basically having a melting pot vision for America, where people with different racial backgrounds come together and share values, political power, and society itself.
So if they're against racial integration, does that mean they want segregation back? If they don't want to share society, do they want society to be divided? Again, that's racist as fuck.
Which also implies that people try to downplay their racial differences in favor of trying to see the common humanity in each other.
Most people aren't downplaying racial differences. The fact is, racial differences are arbitrary and just not relevant to most situations. Should we be focusing excessively on our racial differences? Do you not see how that would make us more divided than ever? Of course not. You're a purely radicalized, insane ideologue. Not you, not the man making this video, but anyone who believes in critical racism theory.
Critical race theorists believe that that process has uneven power dynamics. So the dominant majority group, they say, effectively destroys the identity and the culture of the minority group, which is a process that they call cultural genocide.
That used to be a big problem here in Canada. Basically, the native people were put in residential schools where the Catholic Church attempted to remove their culture, their language, and their spiritual beliefs in a very abusive way. However, that's not happening anymore. And I've personally met about 10 Native elders who went through residential schools. They turned to alcoholism. They ended up in recovery. They got sober. They healed from the trauma they endured. They are now leaders in their communities, and many of them have taken up teaching the traditions of their ancestors. And because of residential schools, children of First Nations descent now have a right to learn about their culture through the school systems, which was a right they didn't have before. It doesn't erase the damage that was done, but it's a genuine effort to make amends. And today, Native people have the right to hunt, fish, live off the land, practice and speak their language, and practice their traditions. And their education, for the most part, like for a large part rather, is paid for. It's not perfect, but it's progress. Critical racists are acting like the residential schools are still a thing, or like Jim Crow is still a thing, when it's just clearly not, and it's completely out of touch with reality to act like it is.
Critical race theorists aren't a fan of that, and instead they want to conserve the traditions and values of minorities by resisting racial integration. Critical race theorists believe that between integration and colorblindness, all of this rhetoric about trying to downplay the significance of race in our minds is not working out for minorities.
That's a really fucking racist thing to say. What about the sports leagues that are majority black? What about the fact that the US had a black president? What about all the black people who were raised in poverty, got involved in crime, and ended up leaving it all behind and finding success? What about the Native elders I mentioned previously who got sober and ended up being leaders in their communities, passing on the traditions of their ancestors? Do none of those count simply because other minorities aren't doing so great? What about all the people who aren't minorities yet are still born into poverty, molested by family members, abused by parents, and on the streets addicted to drugs as teenagers? Do they not matter because their skin is white? You act like minorities have no agency of their own and are incapable of finding success without special treatment, which is racist as fuck. Sorry, not you, the critical racists. This is so much worse than I thought it was going to be. Holy shit.
So they call for a sharp correction in the opposite direction by trying to normalize something that they call race consciousness. Being race conscious doesn't mean that you have kind of a casual, dim awareness of race, but it means that you look at race with profound significance.
The only people who look at race with profound significance are racist. Look, I've heard enough. If you want to watch the whole video, it will be down below, a link in the description. Critical racism is so much worse than I thought. They think we're going to solve racism by punishing anyone who isn't a racial minority and rewarding anyone who is. Why not give a helping hand to those who need it regardless of their race? Why not judge people based on the content of their character? Because if we did that, these race grifters would be out of the job and they would have no more excuses to be bigoted assholes. If your kids' schools are teaching this bullshit, I suggest you homeschool them as soon as possible. I could go on about this, but I would ultimately be repeating myself. So in closing, fuck critical racism and thank you, for watching.